replace the words defense with the MG, and you have the speech in a nutshell. You go to that speech without any sort of confidence or oomph to it. You are putting your team behind, and it's just not a good place to be. It is amazing how much of speaker points and all other components of this activity are predicated off of the same things there. Some of the very best MGs I've ever watched go into every speech with just this look on their eyes, and it's a lot of fun to watch. So I've prepared a PowerPoint on the MG speech. Whoop. Oh, okay. Okay, so impossible dream, striving for the perfect MG. The MG, as you all already know by now, easily one of the most difficult speeches. One shot to answer 8 minutes or 20 minutes of prepared offense shelled you in the course of an 8-minute period of time. You will make many mistakes and you will lose more rounds as an MG than you will win. Your partner will probably get credit for anything you do right, so it's very much the thankless speech of the activity, but with a few tweaks here and there and with constant emphasis on working hard, perhaps one day you can give an ideal MG, but probably never perfect. Nobody's perfect, maybe. Anyways, so let's start with some do's and don'ts. Do start with T or case, depending on if they've read T or not, then you would be reading case. I would say always stand up. The reason for this being that even though you can sit down in some instances, it's important to have that diaphragm nice and well adjusted, not squished from sitting. Additionally, I've always felt like standing up gives you a sort of commanding presence within the room. Also, Colin Patrick says so. So, good. Do be offensive. Not offensive. Spelled something wrong. Do be offensive. Some of the greatest MGs that you will watch online, every single argument they are making has a function within the broader scope of the debate. It's basically identifying or making arguments that are all, in theory, something that the PMR can collapse to. Obviously, not everything is going to do that. Next is be a block monster. This position, more than any other position within the debate, requires you to have blocks prepared and blocks memorized. Don't know if any of you came to my last lecture, but I talked about the importance of block writing and what that means in the broader scope. In this case, it means having your returns to criticism memorized. It means having a set of permutations and perm net benefits. It means having a framework that you are prepared in the event that somebody reads a criticism. It means having a stylized or specific way that you go about answering every single counter plan along the way. Do speech redos, record yourself, and you'll get much better. And along the way, group the lessons you've learned, group the arguments you see, answer and go. Don'ts. Don't out-talk yourself. One of the biggest problems that I had throughout my time as an MG in college was that oftentimes I would try to start out my speech at 100% speed. This would frustrate my coaches, confuse the judges, and usually result in me either sputtering, which meant that in the long term my speeches were actually slower than had I started out at a more reasonable pace to begin with, and, oops, spelled that wrong. Anyways, I would also encourage you not to take more than one question. There are, of course, exceptions to this, like on the permutations, or, well, can't really think of any other things off the top of my head, but in any case, you've got a lot to get through, and in a higher level or a fast level round, don't let them ask too many questions, but I'm generally not ever going to take more than one question. I would say, cautionary thing, I am not actually telling you to only take one question. Don't tell your coaches, don't tell anyone else that I told you to do this. It will only get me in trouble. But keep in mind that the more questions you're taking, the more they'll feel free to ask more questions. I would also say that in terms of, I guess, the do's, do avoid repetition as well. And that is, again, something that can be found or best understood vis-a-vis watching yourself in videos. It's amazing how many tics you will find both verbally in terms of filler and in terms of like movements that you are making. I have lots of verbal fillers that I used to have and still have. I cannot recall exactly what those are, but if you ask B-Silk, he'll give you a good chuckle and tell you all of them. The ideal MG order. Ideal MG order, assuming that all of these things are components, is you start with T, go to case, or the K, and then counterplanes, and then the disadvantages. Obviously, this would vary round to round if something was different, but seems to be a pretty strategic thing. T. You should be spending no more than a minute's time answering any T position. Given the exception to that would be if somebody read a particularly long T shell, but on the whole, when you are doing drills in preparation for being the MG, you should have somebody read a T shell to you, and you should allow yourself no more than a minute to do so, at least when you're practicing. Be clear on the interpretations, and if you think that there's any doubt the first time around, read it again. Watch for lazy voter explanations from LOs. The number of people that will either not impact out their T as a voter to an a priori issue is kind of astounding, and it's something that my partner and I were able to beat up on a great deal, because if you're not providing that, then it's a reason as to why you could say the T might come last. There's lots of different things you could be saying in that instance. Any questions so far? Answering the criticism. Kind of screwed up with the formatting right here. Most people would say that when answering a criticism, you want to be answering the alternative first and reading things like a permutation as well as permutation net benefits to begin with, because that is, one, the most vulnerable part of the position, and two is just kind of like, well, actually, just that, exactly. It's the most vulnerable part, and it's also most important that you get there. I'm kind of the opinion that if you are of a decent speed, and the K is not on the bottom, so long as you're fast with it, I never felt the need to move it up, and it was never really a problem for me. Here's how I think that you should conceptualize answering the criticism. In addition to reading the framework, which as a good and advanced MG you will have read or the ability to read quickly, you will read not only your block, or you will race to the middle on the framework question, you will do so quickly and accurately. Now, let me backtrack a little bit here. There are a couple of different types of frameworks as I've come to think of them as the MG. There are people that will read frameworks that will attempt to preclude your entirety of the case. That is the fiat is destructive and illusory, prefer our representational arguments, and shit like that. In instances like that, you would have to be reading, I guess, more of your framework, hence of why role-playing is necessarily good. That's, role-playing as the USFG is good. We get to learn about governments. It's the only time we get this type of education, blah, blah, blah. Another type of framework is certainly one that is an attempt to race to the middle. These are the types of frameworks that will not attempt to preclude the math. There is nothing offensive in it other than them saying that they get to interrogate the representations. Does that make sense? In instances where people read a framework like that, it would behoove you to identify the offensive components, if any, and race to the middle. We will defend that the representations of the plan action are a good thing. Does that make sense? The number of times over the course of 3 years that I got away with only saying to their framework, the Joe Allen and 12 argument is that all arguments are representational, is astounding. Other thing that you need to be doing when you're looking at their framework is paying very close attention, particularly when flowing, for spikes within the framework. Oregon used to read this argument that would discuss the ways in which, if you do not have an adequate justification for your, or provide an adequate justification for your representations, then that is a reason as to why you can be suspect over the entirety of the truth claims of the PMC. Meaning that unless you answer that one argument, they will get up in the MG, or not the MG, they will get up in the block, extend that argument, and the judge is able to check out on the idea, well, you didn't answer this argument. It means I have reason to think that your entire affirmative case is a lie. And it's things like that that you have to be looking out for. But the fun part of it is, if you're able to find justifications within the literature of your criticism to craft such an argument, putting it in the LOC when you are reading a K will make life hell on the other team. But that was just a side tangent.
On the K, I've heard that it's best to start with the alt because that's all you've got.
Right.
And it's yes.
Right, I said that at the beginning. Go ahead and start with the alt. I didn't care when I did it, but now. But, I mean, on the whole, let's say you start with the alt. With blocks that you would have hypothetically already memorized, which you spit out now, 30 seconds to a minute, spend maybe a minute to 2 minutes reading impact terms, and maybe another 30 seconds to a minute reading framework. Answering the K can be very, very efficient. It is only a question of how well do you know your craft? Can you read your own handwriting? Are you regurgitating or throwing this down in a quick way? Other thing that I would add, in addition to after you answer or perm the alt and deal with the alt solvency, is as obnoxious as it is, you have to find a way to get rid of their utterly unwarranted perm preempt arguments, like perm is illegitimate because it's ideological severance. It's like, you have to answer that. It's silly, and I don't really have a good way of answering it other than this argument is unwarranted. There's no explanation as to why this is whatever they say it is. Also, as an MG, when listening to the LO, be demanding. Asking questions is your friend in that instance. You should always be able to get an alternative text and a counterplan text in either case. And if they don't provide you one right away, that might be grounds for a procedural. We've had rounds before where their unwillingness to give us a text has altered my capacities to answer them or, prep, because your prep time is during the LOC. You get the text right away or make an issue of it in some instances, because that can be problematic. All right, any questions about answering the K? Yeah.
What's the strategic value of the framework first as opposed to putting the alternative first?
I guess that I didn't have a strategic value to it, which is why I'm telling you guys that you could just do it the other way. I didn't see value in the other way. It was just kind of like, I'm going to get through all of this regardless.
Yeah.
Flipping it around doesn't mean too much. I would say that one instance in which it is pretty important is if you got to the K last, then it's important that you're reading a perm before the final minutes of your speech, because otherwise they could claim that's abusive. I think that also perceptually, if you're to go for the permutation later, it would probably be best if it wasn't something you got to with little time left. So I guess that.
It's like the only one. Okay, that makes sense.
I mean, honestly, some of the best criticisms that you'll see will have components of it all over the place that are most important to get to, in the same way that I was just describing that framework, the framework arguments to you all. Any other questions before I go on to the next thing? Cool. Counterplans. I've kind of come to regard a lot of counterplan debates within our activity as fairly weak, particularly among the mid-levels. If you hear a counterplan with only a couple of explanations, like, come on, how many counterplans have you all collectively heard? They read the counterplan text, they talk about competition, and then the solvency is, we can solve it too. And that's kind of it, right? I mean, the point is, it's a pretty happy birthday to all of us, all MGs, when you get a counterplan that doesn't have a lot of game on it. I think it's quick to dispense of. Now, does anyone here not understand what I mean when I say PTSD? Cool, no worries, man. PTSD just refers to an ideal way that you can conceptualize, think of, or remember a way to answer a counterplan quickly. So at the very, very top of the counterplan, you read a permutation, right? So perm, to both USFG and China will, something like that, right? And then you read net benefits to the permutation. Perm shields the link to the China relations disad, because if they're both doing it, China wouldn't be mad. And perm is double propensity for solvency. You read your permutation. This is where getting a text from them is particularly important on things like the counterplan text, because you will be criticized if that does not all line up nice and tidy. Theory? It would be the TNet. I personally am of the opinion that unless a counterplan is abusive, like object fiat, which is like if I had a counterplan in the case of like a resolution with China, and I just did something with China that might be object fiat, that might be one of the few instances where I think theory is really worth your time. And so I'm not going to go too much into counterplan theory, and I'm sure there are plenty of counterplan lectures at this co-op that all talk about this. SD, so solvency. That's the solvency component of the answers. I think that most apps worth their weight in anything are going to have built-in components to it that will defend you against the counterplan. These are things like arguments under the solvency or on the links as to why your actor is uniquely good for what you are doing. I mean, when I try to write affirmatives, I like the second advantage to be entirely predicated off of the actor's action. Puts the other team a step behind from Jump Street. This is the part in answering counterplans where you are generating reasons as to why they would not be able to resolve the case in the same way. 2, 3 quick answers to that, and then disads. Also, just heads up, getting the status of the counterplan. If the counterplan is unconditional and you can think of lots of disads to their actor, great. As Joe Allen once said, in this very room too, if somebody reads an unconditional counterplan, you should punish them by reading lots of disadvantages to the counterplan. Likewise, as I was gleefully explaining to people earlier today, disads to the counterplan get to be so very cheater. You get to do half of the work and generate just as much of the argument credibility. And when I say disadvantages, you need to be thinking about their actor, what their actor might be focused on, and like the link level would be what the potential political fallout from such an action would be. Last year at the co-op, we had a topic on the EPA, and maybe it wasn't on the EPA, it was on the environment. And we chose one actor, and the people we were debating chose the EPA as their actor. We read an EPA-focused disadvantage on the pebble mines in Alaska would be an example of what that would look like in theory or in practice. So you understand PTSD a little better there? Yeah. All right. Already explained to you all that sometimes the explanations about how they solve the case can be a little lax. Don't let them get away with this. And I don't mean like raise your hand and ask them about this. I mean this becomes an argument for you and the MG. If there isn't an explanation as to how they solve the internals on, or how they solve for the advantage 2, then you should probably be sitting on that. Even if it is just something that makes them spin their wheels down the line. Disads. Quickly stepping back, I think that as you develop and grow as MGs, and you learn to answer each of these positions, and you continue to do drills, one of the most invaluable things is you start to slowly think about all the ways in which you can begin to answer each of these things as efficiently as possible. You understand which arguments don't get you anything along the way. Really quick, yeah.
Just quick on the disads to the counter plan. Kenny and I were going back and forth about this earlier, actually. Do we put a disad to the counter plan on the counter plan page, or would you recommend a new sheet of paper for that?
I mean, if we're talking about baby disadvantages to the counter plan, I would tell the judge just to put it on the same sheets.
Okay.
Depending. I mean, it's kind of one of those no-win questions, in that every judge is going to have a different opinion about that. Judges like Ben Dodds here in the Pacific Northwest is just like, yeah, man, I have a badass flow. You don't need to tell me where to flow. So that will vary.
Okay.
And I mean, like, worst case scenario, you read it on the counter plan. Maybe it's a little more organized for you, and the judge tells you next time to put it somewhere else. But I would say it depends on the length of it.
Okay.
Backtracking really quick. A good way to practice and train on your way to perfecting the MG is to do things like cold drills. Cold drills in this case is, I would have my coach read me a LOC strategy. Before he read me the LOC strategy, he would be like, okay, your plan text said this, and these were your two advantages. I'm going to prep these things and read an LOC at you. You're going to have anywhere from no time to 2 minutes to prepare answers and just go. And we did this 2 or 3 times consecutively for like a week. And it's the same thing that you can do with things like tea, is you can have somebody just read tea shells at you. You practice answering them within a minute. They'll tell you what's wrong with it, or you'll figure it out for yourself, and you'll do it until you get it right. It's the most monotonous speech, but also just one of the most exhilarating too. Okay. Disadvantages. I mean, most of you know how to answer a disadvantage. It's one of the first things that you learn to do. You read uniqueness or compete uniqueness claims, read lots of turns, and the more disadvantages, the faster you want to turn them all. And then you want to, I would say that a lot of the time, as the MG, especially if you're able to swing it in terms of time, you want to do comparative work on the impact level, and again, not let other teams get away with unhashed out or unterminalized scenarios. And this is also where you can start to do impact framing or make comparative claims about the two. One of the dirty little tricks that I had when I was a youngin' debater is I would say at the bottom of their disadvantage that their impact wouldn't happen for 30 to 40 years. And if that's conceded, then that's just easy pickings in the PMR, especially from a time frame comparison. Additionally, you can be looking for ways in which your case would presumably resolve impact claims from jump street. So, I mean, the more comparative you can get with the claims, the better. And the sooner you do that, the farther ahead in the debates you will be. Any questions? How should your extensions look? Before rounds and after prep time, or maybe it's the last 2 minutes of prep time, you should have a conversation with your PM about the case, if you weren't already sitting in on it. You should have discussions about spikes. You should be briefing the PM or talking with him or her about the possible counter plans that you think you might see, just anything and everything with regard to that. And from there, that should inform what, or going into the round, what you think the extensions would look like. This would be particularly true if you were to read a critical app. As the NG, you would probably have 2 to 3 minute, or not 2 to 3 minutes, but you would probably have 20 to 30 second explanations of a particularly important piece of the flow or the PMC arguments that you would want to emphasize. Now, I say that this varies critic to critic because the reality is I've dealt with a couple of different types of critic. The first of which will kind of grant that you have your case after the PMC is read. The practice of repeating it extend is just a very monotonous and unnecessary thing, particularly because it has already been read aloud, and especially if it is uncontested. But other critics, like, for example, if you ever have Kristen Stevens in the back, making extensions of case clean and clear and repetitive is very, very important. So be sure to do that in front of some critics. Extensions are easy, but remember, be a good MG and don't just say extend this argument. You need to explain what that argument is, and then you need to follow that up with an explanation as to why that matters. Concession of the uniqueness here means it is a try or die scenario over the question of U.S.-China relations. Something like that. Just brief explanations. In the grand scheme of things, there are so many, many, many arguments. So what should you do? I would say be tactical. This means picking and choosing which arguments are most important and isolating choke points. After you've done it a while, all of the little parts just kind of glare out to you in a magical MG sense sort of way. How I really felt like a lot of my MGs started to get significantly better was adopting a method that I actually saw of somebody else's flow, but took me a while to be like, I should do that too. Instead of writing down what they said, I found myself writing out my answers instead, and that allowed me to be pretty quick, but whatever you need to do it. When should you kick arguments? Again, jury is relatively out on this. If somebody spends too much time on an advantage and it's not critical to your strategy moving forward, and all of the arguments they're putting are defensive, it might be in your best interest to kick that position. But you should always be considering whether or not you are telegraphing to the block which way they have to go in the round. I mean, think of it this way. It is just as easy for your PMR to kick out of a position, particularly if all of those arguments are defensive, as it is for you to do so. I mean, that's just... So, yeah. Next is, I would say, don't be a slave to their time allocation. You should be, if anything, looking to always be better than how they moved through a position. Example of this would be, if you do have particularly ball and T answers, and they spend more than a minute, it's like, great, well, you're coming out ahead. Yeah. Okay, MG theory. Bang, bang, what's the hang? So I found this discussion a little bit interesting, hypothetically, particularly as is applied to things like questions of, should we read conditionality, or should we read conditionality in the PMC, or read conditionality in the MG if we know that a team is going to be doing that? Adam Krell had some pretty invaluable insights over this question. In a world where you get the first and the last speech, if you have the opportunity to read a piece of MG theory in the MG as opposed to in the PM, they only get one shot at answering it. Furthermore, they don't know if you're going to go for it or not. Means that it's strategically advantageous to be reading things like MG theory, things like conditionality bad, or multi-actor fiat illegitimate. You know, things like that can put you ahead at the end of the debate, or for that matter, bifurcate where the other team thinks that you're going. My first year of debates, I took a great deal of pride in that we had a Condi shell that I was able to spit out in 30 seconds. I was very, very pleased with myself that no matter what, they were probably going to spend more time than I was, and that was going to force a time trade-off. Likewise, when you find yourself having to answer MG theory, always put at the bottom of the piece of paper when answering it that you should evaluate MG theory with extreme prejudice because there is only one opportunity to answer it. But, you know, MG theory can be real dirty. Block writing, unless there's any questions on MG theory. always felt that once you have all of the basics down with respect to block writing, you should be seeking to fill in additional gaps. If you hear that a team from the University of the Pacific is reading a criticism on artificial happiness, maybe you want to write a blog on that. Always be adding to that. Be a student of the news and a master of your files. Be adding to your updates, and for that matter, making tweaks when you don't see an argument within your blog arsenal that is working for you. The more you know, the less you will have to flow. Lastly, I would say that the MG should always remember that in the case of the case, the better the case construction is, the better the MG's defense of it is. Just like your king of the castle. Your case is your best friend. Know it, love it, use it, abuse it, take off parts and stuff like that. And leverage these scenarios. All PMCs should be impacting out to nuclear war, or not nuclear war, but be impacting out to either extinction or dehumanization. What that means is that in most instances, you are able to frame or set up a debate in a way that one of those two things becomes an inevitability, and it should probably be hedged, starting with you, against the LOC in one manner of speaking or another. Do you have any specific questions while I brainstorm what more to talk about? Anything you were expecting or hoping from this lecture? Watch the Mighty Ducks clip again.
I'm done. I'm done. That's awesome.
General thoughts? Any debate questions?
You can totally do a voiceover of the Mighty Ducks speech and just replace it all with MG yourself. Make your own video.
Just like bad dub.
Yeah, make it really bad too. MG.